Now you understand I'm going to have to explain to her why no Nikos today. And this will be a grumpy dog.
Just tell her it's not Wednesday.
Yeah. I'll tell her it's the 4th. Oh, poor Coco.
I know, she looks heartbroken.
Yeah, she has it. She has it really, really tough.
It looks like she's having an anxiety attack.
Oh, speaking of that, you might want to remember my daughter, and I don't want to make too big a deal about it, but she's, right now she is alone in her apartment in Morgantown because she lived with a girl who graduated. And, you know, Morgantown, they don't have dorms at Morgantown, so, except for freshmen. And then after you're a freshman, you have to get an apartment that the university has connections, but it's an apartment. And her roommates graduated. And so they're off. One of them's going to come back for, you know, in a couple of days. But she's by herself. And she's feeling a little bit of stress. And WVU's got a lot of issues. Lord have mercy. And not just a coach that doesn't know what city he's in, you know, when he's been heavily drinking. And so, but real big financial problems. And she works for the university and they're discontinuing student employment in a lot of areas. She's in one of the only places that's kind of safe because she does tour guides. She does the tours. And the university isn't going to cut the guides for prospective students. They need that too much, but you know, other people she knows they've cut it, and it's not a good, and they'll be doing something she's having to deal with a lot with prospective parents. The state legislature passed a carry law, so in a year any student can carry weapons into classrooms. So that's new policy in all state universities in West Virginia. So, and so parents, particularly from out of state, are apprehensive about sending their kids to West Virginia University. So I don't know.
What is the carry law age?
I assume you can carry at 18. So I'm assuming it's 18.
In Pennsylvania, I think it's 21.
Yeah, I think it's 18 in West Virginia.
Concealed carry here is 21.
Well, I don't know. I think it's 18.
Okay.
But it's an interesting dynamic going on, and so they're very concerned about that. So anyway, but we're looking at Exodus. But just remember her. We're looking at Exodus. And we've said Exodus is a continuation of Genesis. And what has occurred, what have we been dealing with since we entered Exodus? Because we ended Genesis with Israel, Jacob and his sons there. And Joseph being in, you know, having this position of authority, and Joseph dying, and the people of Israel, the sons of Israel, living in Goshen, the prime land. What have we seen? So that's why we ended Genesis. But Joseph saying, take me back to Egypt. Take me back to Palestine when you return to the land. What has happened in Exodus?
There's a Pharaoh that doesn't know Joseph.
Okay, we got a Pharaoh who doesn't know Joseph. And what's happened to the children of Israel?
They've multiplied greatly and become... Egyptians have become afraid of them and made them slaves.
Okay. They multiplied, the Egyptians have made them slaves. The Egyptians have made them Hebrews. The Egyptians have made them Hebrews. Because Hebrew is kind of a derogatory term for someone who was born on the other side of the river. You know, a foreigner. And those were the enslaved. So, you know, they become part of a big social class. Part of a social class called of Hebrews in Egypt, and the Egyptians have enslaved them. What's the story? Who in this Exodus that we're looking at? This story of Exodus, who's the protagonist? other than God. Of course, God is continuing to drive this story. Who becomes a human protagonist in the story? Moses becomes a human protagonist. And tell me a little bit of Moses' story.
There was a law that said that all male children had to be killed, and the mother hid him, and he floated to the sister of the Pharaoh, and she decided she was going to keep him, and he
Okay.
was raised as somebody important in Egypt.
Okay, he ends up, in fact, the name means drawn out. So he's drawn out of the water, and he's raised, although it's a kind of an interesting thing because he's nursed by his mother for a while, and he's aware that he's a Hebrew. I mean, he's aware of that because very little about him being raised. If you want to know more of the history of his early adulthood, watch the movie.
Yeah.
And then you'll know all about Charlton Heston and Yul Brynner growing up together. But there's nothing in Scripture about that. That's just not there. But we do, in fact, after that little episode, the next time Moses makes his appearance is what happens?
When he kills
an Egyptian, and who is dumping on some Hebrews, and hides them in a
buries in the sand.
Yeah, the sand. And then, some Hebrews are fighting, and he says, guys, you can't do that. We're brothers. And they say,
we're going to kill him.
yeah, ooh, you will kill us now. And Moses says, oops, now I could be in big trouble.
Now it's out.
Yeah, now it's out. So he goes to Midian, which is in Sinai. And so he goes to, actually, on the other side of Sinai, in northern Arabia, Saudi Arabia now. So he goes there, meets his father-in-law, whose name is Jethro, meets his wife, Zipporah, and has 2 kids and is just settling in to be a shepherd. That's going to be his career when something happens to him as he's, tending his flock in Sinai. What happens to him? Burning bush. And what happens with the burning bush?
It doesn't burn.
It doesn't burn. Yeah, it's a non-burning bush. And what occurs with the burning bush?
It's God talking.
Okay, God's talking to him and gives his name, which is the name you don't say. The letters that you're not supposed to say out loud. And he sends Moses back to Egypt to say, let my people go. Only Moses isn't going to say it because for whatever reason. And who's going to do it?
Aaron has to talk.
Aaron is going to be the spokesman. Now, like I said in here, that's all of these stories are for people later. These aren't reporters writing stuff down for what's happening here. It's stories that are passed down later. And by having Aaron be the spokesman, now we're establishing the Aaronite priesthood. We're establishing a priesthood that's going to continue. It's going to continue in the New Testament. That's what Caiaphas and Annas were. They were Aaronite priests. So that priesthood is going to continue, and they establish it here. That's why, Moses is of the tribe of Levi, and even though Levites aren't important yet, they will be. And so we've got Aaron is going to be the spokesman. Moses is going to do it. Interesting that the writer doesn't present Moses necessarily in a Charlton Heston-like way, but kind of a man that has flaws. He's always hesitant. I don't want to do it. Don't send me. I don't do this well. I'm not the guy. I'm not your guy. So the writer who's putting this together, conveying, is not portraying a hero. Now, why is he? Why? Because you see other ancient works. You have people that become heroes from the past. The sagas about the great men. Why wouldn't the writer of this, which is comparable in terms of when it's written and how it's written, why isn't it portraying Moses as
Because it would put him ahead of God.
Okay, it muddies that water because God is the principal protagonist in this. It's God, again, just like it was in Genesis, this is God's story. This is what God is doing. And what does God end up doing?
Taking the people out of Egypt.
Well, he takes it between sending Moses and taking the people leaving. What occurs?
He punishes.
Yeah, 10 plagues. 10 plagues. And God is very clear, or the writer, because again, the writer tells us, and when you read scripture, always important to have that in the back of your mind. The writers do not want us in the story. They don't want us in the story. We're looking down on the story because the writers tell us stuff that the people in the story don't know. Because we know what God says to Moses. We don't know it because Moses tells us. We know it because we hear God saying it. So the writer tells us God said this to Moses and we hear it. So we're not supposed to be there in the story. We are above the story looking down. Same thing with the New Testament. That's why we know the motivations of the Pharisees, that nobody else knows, but Jesus knows, we know. Nobody else there knows it. The writer tells us what's going on in their heads. That's what's going on here. We're hearing God speaking. So God is really clear on why the plagues are happening. Why are the plagues happening? There's only one reason why it's happening. Huh?
To punish the Egyptians.
Well, that's interesting because he doesn't say it's a punishment to the Egyptians. You remember what it
God's
says?
in charge.
God is in charge. Therefore, what's the purpose of the plagues? And he says it repeatedly.
Display his power.
That's it. The plagues are to display his power. And that's why there are some odd things when you read the plagues about the plagues. Why does Pharaoh say you can't go? Which is really pertinent in this story.
Sometimes the Egyptian magicians can do the same thing.
Right, with the Nile and stuff.
They don't want to lose their workforce either.
All of that is probably working. But the writer tells us, why does Pharaoh not let him go? God hardens his heart. And over and over and over again, God hardens his heart. Which means what?
God's in control.
God's in control. Well, Pharaoh's not in control. There are even places where Pharaoh says,
Go.
Go.
And then I change my mind.
Go. And it says, his heart was hardened, which is passive verb, was hardened. Divine passive. When you run across a passive verb, 9 times out of 10, God is the actor. A passive verb depends on the object. The object is the actor in a passive verb. So was hardened. Pharaoh didn't harden his own heart. It was hardened by something else. And so the something else is God. Because this is God's story and God's glory being revealed. Paul's going to pick up on this in the 9th chapter of Romans. That's what Paul talks about. Why did God harden Pharaoh's heart? Because that sure seems unfair. Because Pharaoh was a free actor. Pharaoh should have, it must be. It must be because Pharaoh was a jerk. No, it wasn't because Pharaoh was a jerk. He may have been, but that's not why he had the plagues. It was because God hardened his heart. God is in charge. This is God's story. And that's what Paul says. Understand, this is God's, the whole Old Testament is God's story. People may think they're doing that, but this is really God's story.
Isn't the whole Bible God's story? Because the object of the whole Bible is to get us to the position so that God can dwell with us. And so everything happens in order to achieve that.
There's a wonderful book written, and I can't tell you the author, but it would be maybe 25 years ago. And it's based on the Old Testament. And the title of the book is God, a Biography. And the writer says his thesis, as he expounds on the Old Testament, is the Old Testament is God's biography. It's not about the people of Israel. It's about God. Mm-hmm. And that's what we see, and that's what Paul says in in Romans, and he says it isn't unfair because God's intention is what, Barb?
Mercy and compassion.
Mercy and compassion, always. Therefore, if it was mercy and punishment, then, having Pharaoh, especially the last of the plagues, is horrible. But the intention is mercy, always mercy and compassion. Therefore, God is doing the plagues, according to Paul, in order to be merciful and compassionate to whom? Pharaoh and his descendants. That's the means by being compassionate to Pharaoh. Okay, so we go through the plagues, and then the people leave, and again God intervenes because he's got one more display of power.
Drowning them in the...
That's right. So the Egyptians chase after him, and they get to the Red Sea, and I don't care whether it's the Sea of Reeds or the Gulf of Suez or the Red Sea.
Still happens.
Who cares?
Still happens.
Who cares? Doesn't really matter. But it was a pretty spectacular thing. What happens at the shore of the Red Sea?
Which side?
Well, what happens both sides? Okay, the water's part. And again, symbolically becomes really important because water is this wonderful Old Testament symbol of chaos. And so God has done something that God does. He pushes back the chaos. The children of Israel cross. And they cross. God does it because the children of Israel, they're faithful, right? He opens it because they're faithful. No, they're not faithful. Because what are they doing on the shore of the Red Sea? They're complaining. Because the children of Israel complain all the time. And so they're complaining. They want to go back to Egypt. Why have you done this to me? Separated. Boom. The Israelites go across. What ends up happening when the Egyptians move in?
More chaos.
God removes his protection, chaos reasserts itself, the Egyptian horse and rider is thrown into the sea.
Don't you think a lot of the whining is due because when you're slaves you don't have anything positive to think about?
Well,
or is it just human nature?
Well, I think from a literary standpoint, and remember we're talking about conveying a story later. By having the people constantly complain, what is the writer communicating to people that are living 2,000 years after this?
Don't complain.
Well, part is if you talk about faith, these guys were complaining all the time. Maybe faithful people don't complain all the time. That may be a sort of a negative lesson. So I think that's certainly part of it. What else might the writer be doing? Why else might the writer? Remember, every word written is written on papyrus, which means every word has a value. Like I've said before, the words I write have no value because I can write as many of them as I want, and it doesn't cost me a dime. I can add 5 words, and it doesn't cost me anything. But then it did cost, because what they're writing on is so precious and valuable. So it did make a huge difference. And yet, they wrote it. Why would the writer constantly be going back to people complain, because he just could have left it out. He could have left it out and the story would have flown just the way it did, or flowed just the way it did. Why would the writer be putting this in? And we're going to see today. Over and over, people complaining, people grumbling, grumble. Why is he taking precious space to write this to people who are living 2,000, 1,500 years after? Certainly there's a lesson, I think, of faith. What else?
It's possibly because when they see that God is actively working in their lives, that they don't appreciate it?
Who?
The Israelites, the grumbling, complaining, but for the people back that the story is being written for, they can see that people aren't appreciating.
Okay, good. I think that's right. And maybe you shouldn't look back, which sometimes Christians do a little bit. And we do it because of people like Luke, who kind of write it that way. You look back, gosh, if I'd been a disciple, boy, were they ever lucky. Gosh, they thought, Jesus was right, boy, that's really good. Mark is really intentional. No, those disciples were a mess. They were way worse than you. I think this is something else, that causes the people to think, geez, if I'd been there, I'd have had a little bit more faith in these guys.
I wouldn't have complained.
Yeah, and I think that's what the writer's saying. That's exactly right. So one, don't deify these people as somehow paragons of some kind of virtue, or that they deserved it.
If they didn't complain, then the fact that God is actively working and everybody can see it, they become like elevated.
Right. And I think that's why he's really careful that he doesn't want any human beings in this story to be elevated too high. And that's why I think he'll intentionally. And I'm saying he as though there's one, but it's probably coming from a lot of hands. I think it's very intentional that he doesn't want that to happen. Okay, so we're on the other side. Now we've got, Egypt is done, right? The only time we're going to hear Egypt is the people saying, I want to go back. I want to go back. And one of the things that they really want to go back for
is the watermelon.
Well, it's the leeks. They really love those leeks, wanting to go back to Egypt because they could eat all the leeks they wanted. Well, that has never motivated me to do much of anything. But that was a big deal to the children of Israel. Maybe a nice oysters would have done it for me, but then that was against the law. So they're across the sea. When we get to 1522, well, they're on the other side.
But the oysters weren't against the law.
Yeah, that's right.
I'm sorry.
That's right. Probably not a good idea to eat oysters without refrigeration back then.
Depends on how fresh they are.
That's right. Pop them open. You can't do anything bad to an oyster. All right, so here they are. They're on the other side. Chapter 15, verse 22. What happens? Now they're through the Red Sea, and they're on the other side.
And now the people that are coming up on them aren't too happy.
Okay, now we've got, they are on the other side, and what's the first thing the writer tells us? Now that God has saved them from the Egyptians.
Now the Edomites are terrified.
What's that?
The Edomites are terrified.
Well, with the Edomites, in 1522,
They're in the desert.
they're in the desert. Chapter 15, 22.
Oh, sorry, I'm
Okay, good, because you said Edomites, and I thought, ooh.
I was in 15.
But that's good. No, that's okay. That surprised me. Since I'm not sure what day of the week it is, there could have been Edomites here.
Well, in fact, here in the song, the Edomites are terrified.
Yeah.
Aren't the Edomites Ishmael's
The
descendants?
Edomites
Are Ishmael's
let's see,
descendants?
the Moabites are Lots. The Edomites are Ishmael. Yeah, one of the tribes.
Yes.
But there are 12 tribes
Yes.
from Ishmael. So, but they're over there in the desert, right? And interesting, they give locations that would be meaningful, still were around 1,000 years later. So, when the story is being told, they can put pins on a map if
And
they
it
wanted
doesn't
to.
necessarily mean that that's what it was called whenever they were traveling there.
Heck no. But it's written not for them, it's written for people later. Okay, they're in a desert. What's the problem in the desert?
Not much water.
There is no water. They run across some water, but it is bitter, brackish, that's what it is. What do they just start doing? This is going to be a surprise. They start complaining to Moses. What does Moses do? He complains to God. What does God do?
Tell them what to do to fix it.
Tell them what to do to fix it. Put this wood in there, and what happens to the water?
They can drink it.
Okay, now they can drink it. And that's good. Now, while they're there, and this is right at the beginning, God does something that's going to be really important in everything else we look at. And I think it's relatively important for us to be careful as we look at it, because what God is demanding here on this sort of revised covenant in the desert, it may not be what we might assume. What does God do for them right as they begin their journey?
Making to create laws.
Okay, he creates a covenant, an agreement with them, right? And what is the agreement?
If they pay attention to him, he won't bring any plagues.
Okay, if they pay attention and do what?
Obey.
And do it. You know, you gotta listen and you gotta do. Now, I think that's really, really important. You gotta listen and you gotta obey. What it doesn't say is they're expected to trust. And that's why throughout all of this, they don't show trust at all. But that doesn't seem, and I think it's important for us to find a way, that's not what God is looking for. He's not looking for them to trust him. He's looking for them to listen and obey. You know, that's what he wants. And that's why when they grumble and show no faith, you say, oh, well, that must show God is awful loving. No, that's not part of the deal. You know, they don't have to trust that he's going to. That's why he'll tolerate them complaining. You know, the complaining's not the problem. It's when I tell you to do something, I want you to do it. And remember, when we saw in Genesis, Abraham there were 3 covenants made, but 2 different covenants, because 2 were very similar. But you had 2 different covenants made with Abraham. One involved trust. The other one involved obedience. And the obedience, that was the one that was connected with circumcision. You know, to show that you're going to listen, that you're obedient. I'm going to tell you to do something, and I expect you to do it. I don't care whether you trust me or not. When I say do it, I want it done. And that's the deal. And that's what we see here. This is what he's establishing. And so we want to be real careful not to muddy trust in here. Well, certainly, if you're obeying, that's showing a level of trust. So I don't want to say trust isn't involved at all, but that's not the focus here.
Obey and trust, the Pharisees did that.
Yeah.
I mean, to listen and obey,
right, exactly.
They did that,
Right.
but they didn't have trust.
And I think that's a great point, and I think the evangelists are very aware of that. Is the Pharisees were really good with the obedience, but what they demonstrated was the downside of obedience. And when your relationship with God is grounded on obedience, what you're going to do is the same thing the Pharisees do.
Make a list.
You make a list of the big things you should obey, and you got the big things you should obey, but you got to break those down, because how do I know I'm doing them? And so you break those down, and then you have to break what you've broken down. And, you know, then you've got to break it down even further. And so you end up with this extensive, huge set of law.
Tell me.
Yeah, that's exactly right. You end up with this bizarre law that actually, and you focus on doing it, and all of a sudden you miss.
You're not looking to God anymore, you're looking at your Talmud.
Well, the odd thing, the irony is you're not obeying anymore. Because if you say the law comes down to, as it says in the Old Testament, certainly as Jesus said and Paul says, comes down to loving your neighbor, loving God and neighbor, you're not doing that anymore when you're worried about how you wash the inside of a kettle. You know, you're not thinking about loving God and loving neighbor anymore. You're thinking about obeying these tiny rules that you've created. So you've changed the law. You've missed, not even changed, you've missed what the law intended. And that's a big deal. That's Paul's message in Romans, is you're missing. They're missing the law. But here, so it's obedience though. But so we're talking about something very different than this. He's not talking about faith, he's talking about obedience here. And that's going to be the test. How well the people obey. How well they obey. Okay, now we've got, yeah.
Don't you think it's interesting that by doing that, all they showed was the need for Jesus?
I think so. It shows that development. That's where it's going to be moved.
Doesn't save you.
It takes you to a point, but it doesn't take you all the way there. And this is a little excursion, only because I'm thinking about it. There was he wrote The Road Less Traveled. Oh gosh, what's his name?
Robert Frost.
No, I can't think of his name. Oh, Wednesday was the 4th. I don't remember. Scott Peck. Scott Peck wrote The Road Less Traveled. And when Scott Peck wrote The Road Less Traveled, and I think it was late 60s, early 70s, somewhere in there, he was a sort of a Buddhist, open to all ideas, road less traveled, sort of a mystical view of God. Well, he had this intense conversion experience, Christian conversion experience, and became a fundamentalist Christian in the early 70s. And so then he wrote a book called The People of the Lie. The People of the Lie, L-I-E.
Okay.
And he was the people of the lie are the people that were saying what he'd been saying, and that God gave us rules, we need to follow those rules, because he was drifting and had no direction in his life and had no source of hope, and God gave us these things that he could fit in, and this is a sign of God's grace. So forget what I wrote in The Road Less Traveled. You got the People of the Lie is a lot about sin, What's fascinating is then he wrote a book called A Different Drum. Because what happened when he was in this fundamentalist, rule-oriented, he found that the rules, once you're in it a while, he says it was good because he was just wandering around and it gave him focus and direction. But all of a sudden, when you're in a system of rules, you start seeing that the rules, some of them contradict one another by their very nature. And they become overly detailed and emphasize things that aren't important and ignore things that are. And one of the things that he struggled with is he was a chain smoker. That was what and in this group, fundamentalist group, that was unacceptable. That was unacceptable. And so he quit. But he wanted to smoke and couldn't figure out why this is against God's rules, but other things weren't, but this was. And all of a sudden, these rules didn't make any sense anymore. And he said that's part of a growth process. So in The Different Drum, he's still a Christian, but he feels as though he's now free from the rules, that the rules were a transition to move to something that was a little deeper. And you see that, Paul, you see that in the New Testament. And I think that's a good observation. As we develop, this is necessary because you need, direction, but you can't stay there.
Your foundation.
Yeah, you don't want to stay there. You want to visit, but you want to keep on growing.
You want to build the rest of the house.
Yeah, you got to keep on. So anyway, they are there. God says you got to obey. Beginning of chapter 16, what's going on in 16?
They moving.
Okay, they're moving, right? And of course they're moving. And what do they do with Aaron and Moses? Big surprise. They start complaining again. Okay, and now what are they complaining about? Now understand, this stuff isn't, I'll guarantee you, if I am in a desert and I have nothing to drink, I'm going to be complaining. And if I'm in another desert and I got nothing to eat, I'm going to be doing some complaining, especially about the guy who's leading me, right? And so they complain. Now, remember, God doesn't, that's why it's really important. God is not, the deal isn't don't complain. The deal is when I speak, you listen. That's the test.
Do you think it's because if you don't ask, you don't receive?
Well, I think at this point, and we're this is moving towards what? What's coming up in the future? You know, they're in the wilderness.
Reaching the
What is
Jordan.
coming really soon?
Reaching the Jordan.
Well, reaching the Jordan, but between reaching the Jordan and this, what's going to happen that will change everything?
Oh, they're gonna get the law.
They're going to get the law. And all of this, and again, written to people later, all of this is going to be focused on the law that the people later are going to use. You're establishing a historic context for the law to be given. So the focus here, it's not a shocker that the focus is on obedience, because we're getting close to
What the
Moses going up
Well,
going up on the mountain, getting the law. You know, the writer doesn't want to talk about, well, you need to trust God. No, you got to obey. How do you obey? You follow the law, because that's where we're moving. You know, that's where
that
we're
was the purpose of the Israelite people, is following the law.
Right.
And showing the society that could build.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that becomes the second. The land becomes one and the law becomes the second L. You know, both of them become signs of God's presence. Okay, so God, they complain about food. What does God do? And they're complaining about, and I love this, they complain, why can't we go back to Egypt? Remember Egypt? Man, we always had a lot of food. You know, we always had plenty of food to eat. Well, you know, we read Exodus. Life wasn't great for the Israelites in Egypt.
They had to get their own straw.
Oh, Lord have mercy. It wasn't like days of hyacinth. You know, this was a tough time, right?
Do we do that today whenever we say, oh, we need to go back to the way it was in the 50s, the way it was in the 60s? You know, we do that because we only remember the high points, not the lows that we had then.
Sure, and I think we want comfort, and so we want to go back to a time when we felt it, and that's what they want to do. At least it was bad, but at least I knew what to expect. You know, Egyptian was going to beat me every day, but now I don't know what to expect. I'm in the middle of a desert. So they want to go back. What does God do? I mean, if it was all about trust, they are not trusting, clearly, because they're complaining. God would say, the heck with this. You know, I'm not going to help them. But what does God end up doing?
Give the manna.
Okay, you end up getting manna. And again, interesting, God speaks to Moses. Moses speaks to
People.
Aaron.
Aaron, and Aaron speaks to the people, which is the way it's going to be, because God speaks to priests.
It's interesting in verse 4, it says, in this way I will test them.
Absolutely.
To see if they will follow my instructions.
And I'll tell you, that is exactly why I think this covenant is about obedience, because he's going to use this as a test. And we're going to see most of them pass, some of them don't, but this is the test. And so God speaks to Moses, Moses speaks to Aaron, Aaron speaks to the people. And what does Aaron say? What is the deal? What is the word of God being communicated through the priest Aaron to the people?
Pick up your bread on 6 days.
Very detailed, right? Very, very detailed. In fact, in the morning, there's going to be
Manna.
You're going to have stuff on the ground, you know, that looks kind of flaky. And in the evening, you're going to have quail. You're going to have all kinds of quail. So you eat meat at night, manna in the morning. Now, how much manna should you gather in the morning?
As much for that day.
You
except
gather
on Friday.
You gather enough for that day, with one exception, and they use a measurement called an omer. And an omer is about a gallon, although if you were using it for liquid measure, it's about a gallon. But this is dry measure, but it's about a gallon's worth. They also will call sheaves of wheat omers. So that's kind of what it is. So, but as is described here, that's enough for someone to eat. That's enough to satisfy you for the day. And you can gather one day, right? You don't gather enough to last 2 days, with the exception of the day before the Sabbath, right? And the day before the Sabbath, you
2 days.
get 2 days. Okay.
And if
Now,
you didn't listen, it turned back.
okay, now, what happens? What do the people do?
Grumble was, I don't want to eat manna anymore.
Well,
or did we get too far?
We're not there yet.
Okay.
But what do they end up doing? So the next morning, boom, right? Now this is being controlled by God, right? God is the one doing this. Next morning, what's on the ground?
Manna.
You got manna on the ground, and people, they go and collect it, but
Some get too much, some
they
get enough.
some get too much. You know, in fact, they say they did not listen to Moses, and not listening to Moses means they weren't listening
To God.
to God. And the covenant said, you got to listen, you got to obey, and they didn't listen, and they got more than enough. And what happened to the stuff that they got that was more than enough?
It's full of mud.
It became full of worms and turned nasty, you know. And so you can't do any more than just that. And if you don't gather in the morning, like you were told, you got to gather in the morning. What happens when the sun comes up?
It just disappears.
It's
No,
gone,
disappears.
right? It disappears. So you got to listen, and you got to obey. You got to listen, and you got to obey. What happens on the sixth day?
They get twice as much.
They get twice. You gather 2 omers. And you got twice as much, because the Sabbath is supposed to be
A day of rest.
a day of rest. Now, we had that alluded to in chapter 1, but this hasn't been even
It's not a
mentioned
law
in the
yet.
rest.
It's not a law
Yeah, it's
yet.
not a law. What is the writer doing here?
Setting it up for when it is a law.
That's right. He's establishing it almost pre-law, but you know, this is being said, remember there's a continuity between the books. The people who are hearing this have heard the other story, so that they can draw connections. Day of rest, 7th day, God rested. That's what it says at the beginning of chapter 2 of Genesis. You know, that this is a day that people are supposed to rest, and this is sort of in the rules pre-law. Okay, but some people do what?
They go out.
They go out on the Sabbath because they don't, what are they not doing?
Listening.
They're not listening, and they're not obeying. And so they go out, and what do they find? Squat. Now, understand, they don't find, like we'll see later, snakes, you know, to bite them, and diseases. Because remember, he says, I'm going to protect you from the diseases that afflicted the Egyptians. That's the deal. So they're not going to be punished. They just aren't.
Going to get to eat.
They're just not going to get what they want. And if
you
they
know,
had done,
you couldn't even share with someone else because you only had enough for you.
that's right. That's what you were supposed to do. And so that's what you had to. That's what you had to collect. That's what you had to collect. And you know, I think you could say, well, that involves them having to trust that that's enough. Well, yeah. What's most important is that you do what you're told to do. You do what you're told to do. You don't collect half, or you don't collect it and then give half away and trust that God will provide you the rest, because it ain't going to happen, because you didn't listen and obey. You know, you had to do what you have to do. Okay, and what is then God's relationship with the people here? What is God doing for the people?
He's providing.
Okay, he's providing for them. Now, he tells Moses to do something kind of special with some of this manna. What does he tell him to do with this?
Put it in a jar and keep
Okay,
it.
put an omer of this in a jar, and you're gonna keep it. And why are you going to keep this manna?
To show that I took care of you in the wilderness.
To show that I took care of you. Now, we then will assume that what will not happen to this omer of, it won't go bad. It won't go bad. And we're going to see later that what are they going to do with that jar of omer?
You're gonna eat from it for years.
Well, you're right, they're gonna eat on it for 40 years, although we don't know about 40 years, but the writer tells us they're gonna eat on it for 40 years, but in the story, we don't have the 40 years introduced yet. What's gonna happen to that jar of omer that, God tells
It was
Moses
supposed
to
to be
collect?
put in the Ark of the Covenant.
Later, it's gonna be put in the Ark of the Covenant, along with
The rock, his staff.
his staff. It's going to be in the covenant. Okay, so this is something, and what's the purpose of this later? Because remember, this is going to people much later.
So that the people there would be able to see
Yeah,
that it was true.
Yeah, that's right. God was present, was taking care of his people. Okay, so we get this manna and the quails in the wilderness. What's going on at the beginning of chapter 17?
We're back in the desert.
Okay, they're back in the desert. And what's the problem that the people are encountering as they're back in the desert?
No water.
No water. Okay, and of course the people do what? They start quarreling and complaining, right? Because they don't have any water, and of course they
Go to Moses.
grumble. They go to Moses and they say, Moses,
Why'd you take us out?
why did you take us out of Egypt? Egypt was so great. We're going to die, and our children are going to die, and our livestock is going to die out here. And what does Moses do?
Calls out to God.
He calls out to God. Now, again, I find it really interesting that he cries out to God. He is not happy with the people, right? Moses is not, and the writer portraying Moses as irritated with the people. That's kind of a pretty sophisticated way to handle somebody who could almost be viewed as a demigod, as, sort of a divine being between humans. The writer does not want us to see Moses
And it's
as
afraid he's going to get stoned.
yeah, afraid he's going to get stoned. So that tells us they didn't have water, but they certainly had drugs in the wilderness.
That isn't what that said. They had rocks.
Yeah, they had rock music and drugs, and so it was sort of a psychedelic scene, man, out in the wilderness. And so Moses goes and complains to God. And what does the Lord do? Because again, the people, they're grumbling, but that has nothing to do with listening, has nothing to do with obeying. God hasn't told them to do anything. They're just grumbling over a lack of water. Therefore, God's going to respond to their grumbling. What is he going to do?
Tell Moses how to get the water.
Okay, tell Moses how to get the water. And how's Moses going to get the water? Strike a rock with your staff, and
Water will
the
come
water
out.
will flow out. Massa and Meribah. And they called and tested the Lord, something the Lord has done with them, and the Lord does it. I mean, he does what satisfies their need. Okay, in verse 8. So again, we got the Lord satisfying need. What happens in verse 8?
They get attacked.
Amalek comes out and attacks Israel. And what happens during the battle? We got a new character introduced that'll play a role later. Joshua, is introduced, is in charge of troops.
Is this the one where he has to hold the staff out and they win and it puts his arm down and it doesn't?
That's right. He has to hold his arms up. And Moses, when he holds his arms up, he's not stopping the sun. That'll come later.
That's what Joshua, Moses isn't there for that part.
So he lifts his arms up, and the Israelites win.
Oh, but
and when he
one
puts them
time-
down, they lose. And so I'm wondering if Moses ever did one of these kind of. One arm. I don't know. I doubt it. But so what do they end up doing?
They hold his arms up.
First they give. I love it. First they give Moses what?
Rock.
They give him a rock to sit on, because evidently he's standing up, and Moses is getting kind of tired. So they give him a rock to sit on, and Moses says, "Thank you very much," and is holding and then they drop it a little bit, and then what happens?
They hold his arms
Yeah, Aaron and Ur come and hold his arms up, and they keep those arms up all day long. And what ends up occurring?
They win.
They end up winning, and Amalek is cursed. You know, this is going to be something remembered. And why would this be something that would be remembered, or they would want to remember?
Because of Esther.
Well, but what is it about this story is important to remember? What about this story is so
that God is choosing the Israelites.
God is winning the battles. You know, so again, this is God's story. The Israelites, doesn't say the Israelites were better soldiers, were more numerous. They win for one reason. There's only one reason they win. It isn't because Joshua was a good strategist. They win because
Moses didn't put his arms down.
because Moses used the right deodorant that day. Because God did it. God's in control. All right. Now, so we've got, again, God is taking care of his people in the wilderness. What ends up happening in chapter? So we got 17. What happens in 18? Who shows up?
His father-in-law.
His father-in-law shows up. And
this is he's being reunited with his family.
Yes.
Also.
Yeah, which is, and that's kind of I think it's an interesting and awkward, and I'm not sure totally what to do with it. I'm talking about me personally, because it says that Moses did what to his wife and children?
Sent
them away. And I don't know the significance of that. I just don't know. For one, it's never mentioned. It wasn't mentioned before. This is the first time it's mentioned that he did that. I don't know why. I don't know why it's mentioned. There's got to be a reason, but I don't know why it's mentioned here.
It's sent them away. Moses could have been living in Midian, away from Jethro.
Oh, sure.
And send them back there when he
Sure.
went to Egypt.
Right.
And now that they're coming back together because
Right.
crossing the Sinai Desert wouldn't have been
Yeah.
a trip for a woman and the kids.
Yeah, maybe. It's just interesting that it's not, that the way it's worded and shaped, since it doesn't bring back any memories. It doesn't recall anything that's happened earlier in the story. The fact that he mentions it here, there has to be a reason why he did it. I don't know why. Well, yeah, I don't know why. Like I said, every word is valuable. Why he chose, because he didn't need to say it. He could have just said, they came.
Yeah.
You know, why he said, remember, Moses sent him away. I don't know why. So there are plenty of things in Scripture I don't understand. That's one of them. But Moses shows up, wife, his kid. Wife and sons come. How do Moses and Jethro meet? What's the meeting? Now Jethro is identified as what? Not only his father-in-law. What else is Jethro?
He's a priest.
He's a priest of Midian. He's a priest. So he's a priest worshiping the deities worshipped in Midian. Now, it's really important to remember that in the ancient world, including among the Jews, you know, the idea of little g gods, the Jews recognized little g gods. So this is not, you know, we think of monotheism, there's no other God. Well,
that didn't happen
that
until
means,
Sinai.
yeah, well, God is number one. But it doesn't mean what the Jews are going to do is they're going to put those little gods as part of the big guy's court. You know, so they're not going to be equal, but they're not going to say, you know, those gods don't exist. That's going to be something that's going to come much later. You know, this radical monotheism. But here, so that he's worshiping the deities of Midian. You know, whatever gods they worship, because every people will worship gods. Now, there are going to be similarities, because agricultural people are going to worship fertility gods. Shepherds are going to tend to worship masculine gods, because you want your flocks to breed. You know, so it's going to be, you know, the gods that control breeding among animals. So it's going to be a different kinds of gods. But Jethro shows up, and he's a priest, and they meet, and what does Moses say to Jethro? What does Moses tell Jethro?
Told them everything the Lord had done.
Everything the Lord has done. And Jethro's response is, as a priest of Midian, is significant. Well, how does he respond?
Praise be to the Lord.
To the Lord, yes, to the God of Israel, the one who's led the people out. So what Jethro is doing is he's acknowledging the power and actually maybe the superiority of the God that's leading the people of Israel
He
out.
says, now I know that the Lord is greater than all other gods.
That's right, which is pretty important thing for the priest of another religion to acknowledge.
Yes.
So Jethro, but we get the idea then as we look at Jethro that he is not an Israelite, but he recognized this is the God of Israel. Okay. Next day, so we've got Jethro painted here as a positive figure, right? So when Jethro speaks, we the reader are going to say,
oh, we better listen.
Yeah, we better listen. So he's just not a foreigner who doesn't know what he's talking about. Next day, what's going on? What's happening?
Well, this is happening. No, this is happening.
Well,
no,
what's occurring? Jethro is there. Father-in-law is looking at Moses. What's Moses doing?
He has to judge between the people.
Moses is there. And what are the people doing? They're
This one
coming.
took
Everybody's
my
coming.
shoe.
That's right. Everybody is
He
coming.
touched me.
Yeah, like kids on a trip. Yeah. So we got all the people coming to Moses, and I find this to be a very practical, very natural story. That Jethro's observing this, and then what does Jethro do?
He gives him some advice.
Yeah, he says, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? Well, people want to know what God wants, right? And Moses is their connection to God. What does God want? But he also says the people want me to settle
Their disputes.
their disputes. So evidently, what does he do? He's doing this all day long. All day long. And Jethro says, Moses, you're going to be worn.
Delegate some authority.
Yeah, you're going to be worn out. You're going to be worn out. What you need to do is you need to delegate. And he tells them, how do you delegate?
You pick up the responsible men, and then you have under them, and they go here, and if you can't solve it, then it goes here, and work its way up the court.
That's what he says. You get somebody to handle 1,000, get somebody to handle 100, which means you got 10 under him, and then you have somebody handling 10, and you just create this system. But the people you need to appoint what kind of people do you need to?
Trustworthy.
You need to get trustworthy people that you appoint so that they will do the job for you, right? And what does Moses do?
He listens
And he does it. Now, what is occurring here as this happens? What do we see as the writer is describing it? What's occurring when this happens?
It's taking the emphasis off of Moses.
Okay, the Moses, his centrality is diminished. What else, as that's happening, because that certainly is going on, what else is occurring? That's going to be real significant in just a little bit.
The priesthood can be
Well,
given power.
The priesthood is acquiring power. Although he doesn't say appoint Levites to do it. We start seeing
It's like a court system.
a court system. And when you have a court system, what's occurring?
You have to have something to
You-
enforce.
You're having laws and you're having a society develop. So, and what we're going to see with the law is we're seeing a society starting, right here. And it becomes really interesting. And we're going to see the same thing with the law. I mean, if you want to go through the law, Lord have mercy, there are dinky things in the law. There's a lot of dinky stuff. But all of the law came from God. All of it. Even little, tiny, minute things. All of it comes from God. And so what you're doing is you're creating a society where the people in that society believe that the very foundation of the society is coming from God. Therefore, I have to respect it. I have to obey it, because it's not Moses necessarily coming up with it. It's God coming. And that's what's going to happen with the law. Most of the law has nothing to do with worshiping God. It has to do with handling property and disputes, and like any other law. But all of it's going to have divine sanction. All of it's going to be, this is from God's mouth to Moses' ear, and he's conveying it to the people. And that becomes really, really important. The law that the Israelites have isn't radical by ancient standards at all. I mean, this is pretty much what everybody had. If you look at the Code of Hammurabi, it's the same thing. The fundamentals are the same. So the law is just, how do we get along as a people? What's happening here is this is being sanctioned by God. God is doing it. Therefore, don't obey it because of the king.
It doesn't become subjective.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. If it's Hammurabi making the law, then if Hammurabi's brother did something, you might be able to twist it a little
Sure,
bit to
absolutely.
Not the death penalty on this one, but.
Well, and you think about it, and this is something you see in ancient cultures. When kings become representatives and eventually become gods, it's so much easier to enforce the law. Mm-hmm. If it's coming from a human being, do I obey it? Do I not obey it? Well, I'm going to get in trouble if I don't obey it, so I better obey it. But it's still coming from a human being. But if it's coming from God,
you can't sneak it.
Yeah, all of a sudden it has more authority. It's coming from a higher authority, and that's why kings will inevitably also be priests, and eventually will become God, divine themselves, because it gives them more control over people. And this is what we're going to see here as the law is given, and we're really on the edge of developing that society. Okay, any questions about what we looked at today? And I'm going to give you and you're going to need to write it down, because remember, we're looking at the narrative. We are not going to be looking at the law, because there is I don't think there's any good reason to look at all the puny laws that are being given. We're going to look at the narrative story, how God is doing this. Any questions about what we looked at today? Okay, this is what we're going to be looking at next week. We're going to be looking at Exodus 19:1 through 20:26. Exodus 19:1 through 20:26. Then we'll pick up in chapter 24. Yeah, not chapter 4. 24, 1 through 18. And then we'll look at chapter 32, 1 through 33, 8. Now, if you want to read the stuff in between, go for it. That's fine. It's not going to hurt. Lord have mercy. It's Word of God. But it's long. I mean, it's a lot of laws. So, I mean, if that's what you like, enjoy. But I don't know that it's all that pertinent to talk about specifics, because a lot of it are very specific to a time frame, mm-hmm. and really don't necessarily have any application now. Okay, well then let's have a word of prayer and do what you want and go home, I guess. Lord God, thank you so much for giving us this time together. And remind us that you are in charge, and that we need to listen to your word, and that we need to obey it. Remind us, though, that as your Son and our Savior said, the whole law can be expressed by two very clear and emphatic commands: that we love you and that we love our neighbor. That's what he says the law is about. So help us to listen to that, and then help us to be obedient. In the name of Christ we pray. Amen.